Joining me today, I'm happy to have Joseph Scott Morgan. It is so good to have you. I've watched you on the network so many times, have not had the pleasure of having you on my show, so thank you, sir, for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So, you've been following this case, and from a forensic standpoint, you are a forensic death investigator. What are you looking for when you have an alleged child beating murder?
Well, one of the things that I like to look at in these particular types of cases is to see if it's a one-off event or if this is something that has been an ongoing process. And one of the things that we do is, do things like the aging of bruising on children that have alleged to have been abused over a particular period of time to see if there's any kind of history that's connected with this ongoing abuse, or to see if it's some kind of an acute phase where it was an event that just suddenly occurred. Maybe it was a reaction to something. So, and that kind of tells the tale, doesn't it? It's this idea that perhaps it was just a reactionary event as opposed to what you would consider a classic child abuse event that's protracted for, chronically over days or weeks or whatever the case might be.
And it's interesting because those are the points that we've talked about over the last few days. And unfortunately, I'm not sure that information is as available as we would like. It's a little muddy as to what kind of history, if any, of corporal punishment there might have been by the defendant, Lindsay Partin, against Hannah Wesche. We just don't know. Let me ask you this. This is, to me, it's important, and we've seen it a few times. Every time I see the images of the skull, it just takes me to the part of the testimony by one of the treating physicians. If we look at the left-hand image there, as you're looking at the screen, the left-hand image, on the left side of the skull, there's actually a piece of the skull that is separated. It looks kind of like an island. And I know that during the emergency surgery, when they were relieving pressure on Hannah's brain, they removed that actual piece of skull. My question to you, Joseph Scott Morgan, is what kind of force does it take to dislodge a piece of a young child's skull like that?
Well, it's dependent, first off, upon the strength of the perpetrator or the surface that a child might strike, for instance, the rigidity of the surface, or the instrument that was used in order to strike, whether it's a bare hand. We've heard a lot about open hand as opposed to closed hand just in the last few moments. What was, how much leverage could the individual have over the individual physically? I'm not talking about in a metaphorical sense, but literally the leverage that would be applied to this child as she was being struck. There's also another specter that has kind of raised its head in court here, and that's this idea of shaken baby syndrome. They've tried to dance around this term and get away from it because that in and of itself is kind of a controversial topic to get off on. There's some people that believe in it and other people that don't, and this is something else that was addressed. But regardless, this child has sustained a serious closed head injury, and one of the problems is that this child had this tremendous amount of pressure that began to build up in her, within her cranium, and they had to relieve that pressure just so that the kid might have an opportunity to survive. So it paints a rather ghastly picture.
And so when we see these images, and we don't really have, in my opinion, the traumatic events that explain these injuries, it makes it very difficult for a jury, and I don't know that they've seen what they need to just yet. What do you think?
Well, it's interesting. You had mentioned a moment ago that we would not hear this lady testify. But, there are other things that juries see in court, the reactions of these defendants. And, there are a couple of times where she has essentially, just kind of emoted, these deep emotions that she's witnessed, particularly when the autopsy photographs went up. And that tells a lot. Trust me, the jurors are peeking over at this woman. I've sat on the stand before when crime scene images and autopsy photographs are shown in court, and I have found myself looking at a defendant to see if there's any kind of reaction. Sometimes you can testify without getting up on the stand, I believe. So
No doubt.
that's going to be very powerful.
And they've seen so much of her in the interrogation video,
Yes.
at times in which certain things were revealed about the severity of the injuries to Hannah, and the reactions seem to be genuine. But again, you're right, the jury's going to get to weigh all of that information. Joseph Scott Morgan is with me here. Joseph, we've heard through these interviews that were conducted by this officer a series of events admitted to by the defendant, Lindsay Partin, and they seem to escalate a little bit. Explain to me how that process works in the interrogation, and how it's not really, I guess, unlikely to hear things kind of leak out from the defendant.
No, it's not unusual. Over a period of time, as investigators begin to develop a relationship within the construct of that interrogation room with the subject, people become a bit more. You're not as tense, over a period of time, over a protracted period of time. Fatigue is setting in. You're not quite on your toes like you would, and there's a comfort level that kind of sets in, particularly if the investigator might extend some warmth to the individual at some point in time, or withdraw from the individual. You can kind of elicit responses from an individual, and when they let their guard down. So it takes a little while, and interview is not something, contrary to what you see on television or what our fans might see on television. This is not something that just happens all of a sudden. Sometimes these events take a protracted period of time. You spend a lot of man hours in that room working. These guys go to specialized schools in order to do this sort of thing. So you're wanting any bit of information that can come out. And what's really fascinating about the interview process, sometimes you won't pick up on it initially when you're interviewing a person, but when you go back and read a transcribed report, little nuggets will kind of pour forward after you have time as an investigator to kind of go back over the data.
Yeah, and we have seen, as these interviews have played out, that, the science of interrogation is a whole different subject. It is intense, and there are styles that can lead to things you want to know and maybe not. The defense is always going to argue that, hey, you beat somebody up long enough in a room, they're going to tell you anything they want to tell you. So how do you think this guy's doing? Because this is pretty good battering that he's taken on cross-examination.
Well, there's been a few times when, he's gotten a little edgy in responding. I think that he's probably been doing this long enough to realize that it's nothing personal. And that's hard to do. That shows a level of maturity. Keep in mind, he didn't just start testifying once he was sworn in as a detective. He was testifying as a patrol officer. That's the way it works. There's a progression. So he's done a pretty decent job, it would appear to me. I don't know how many of us would stand up under this kind of barrage that he's having to go through at this moment in time.
It seems she can kind of get under your skin, though. She just seems to be like. And one of the key points in this case, and really key to any child abuse allegation, is the timing of the injuries and, of course, what caused them. It is so muddy in this case because we seem to have some holes in the timeline as to who had care of the child when, and when some of the injuries might have been received. Add to that, Joseph Scott Morgan, the fact that she was, little Hannah was alive for 10 days in the hospital, healing, but ultimately to die. How does that all play into this discussion?
It can be a muddy mess, and that's one of the reasons that even in the world that I come from in medical legal death investigation, the medical examiner, the coroner's office, that sort of thing, we have to be able to communicate effectively with therapeutic practitioners that are out there trying to save people's lives. And we spend a lot of time poring over medical records and actually going and interviewing the individuals that are treating. Sometimes we'll bring them into conference with the forensic pathologist. And in a case like this, I suspect that this would have happened in preliminarily, at least at the DA's office, where they got together to talk about what the course of treatment was for this little girl. We've got this ophthalmologist that testified relative to the hemorrhage in the optic nerve. They had already noted that the that she had significant hemorrhage. She's got a strike to the rear of her head, apparently, and very brutal. And it has been stated that the strike that occurred would have rendered her unconscious within a few moments. They're also talking about injuries that may have been sustained to the chin, and there's this. It's not just the treatment that's clouding this. It's also the story of the defendant. She's muddied the waters, I think, again and again with these various stories talking about the child took a face plant on the gravel. She fell down the staircase or down the external stairs with the child. The child's got injuries to her chin. She's shaken the child. She's poked the child. There's a litany of physical contact that she's engaged with this child. There was even a mention that she had squeezed the child as the child began to cry for her father, and that allegedly is when the shaking took place. So it's just a matter, of course, of just kind of taking your pick. I think defense is doing the best that they can do in this to try to convolute things to bring about this idea that there is no kind of linear connection here, and you've got all of this layering, and you kind of spoke to this relative to the treatment that goes on. You want to try to save the child, and the physical body is actually healing, but there are some things that you can't recover from. And closed head injuries many times are one of those things, and that ultimately is what led to her death, traumatic brain death.
Yeah, it's very confusing. The jury's going to have to wade through all of that, and
it is.
They have to be certain in their decision that what they've learned and understand is enough to get them to that guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Joseph Scott Morgan is with me, and we've been talking about the interrogation and the fact that it may be the only chance that the jury gets to evaluate this defendant other than just to see her sitting at the defense table. What do you think about the interrogation, how it's unfolding? This was day number 2. How do you think she's doing?
Well, she's lucid. Obviously, there's no indication that she's impaired in any way. It wouldn't seem, and she's running through her descriptors. She's offering an explanation for what the detective is throwing up at her relative to the insults that this child has sustained, to the ear and these other locations he's indicated on the body. The trick, though, is are these going to marry up with all of the statements taken in total? And how well is the prosecution going to be able to put this narrative together so that the jury can understand it? There's a horrible problem in courts, particularly, we're chief among sinners as scientists. Many times in the forensic field, we talk above people's heads. You got to keep it simple in the courtroom, and keeping it simple in the interrogation room. You don't want to get them in a position where they're don't know whether they're coming or going. If you just allow the individual to talk, and that seems like what they're doing here. If you're going to give them a rope, then give them a rope, and you don't handle it any further.
Yeah, and you can see they even showed video to the jury of the defendant alone in that room so they could read some nonverbal communication. And she was really pretty still, pretty quiet most of the time. We just saw a little clip there where she actually kind of put her head down, put her head on the table. Tired, stressed out, whatever that might mean to this jury. If I were doing the closing, Joseph, I would have a big timeline, not unusual, but I would be putting events on it one at a time to reinforce them because we've been jumping all over the place, and there's no way for the brain to keep those things straight. So let's lay it out for the jury and enter them on the timeline as we learned about them. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree, and I'd be very curious if I was in the courtroom. I'd want to know if the jurors are scribbling anything down, if they're watching this thing as it unfolds. Because I got to tell you, you need a playbill to keep up with everything as it kind of lurches along, and it is very, very confusing. But I think you've really hit the nail here, because if you want to kind of tie this package up. The beauty of the world that we live in now, Michael, is the idea of kind of this demonstrative electronics that we have, and I've seen this done on Law&Crime on several cases we've covered where they put up this timeline and almost it's better than just a standard PowerPoint. It really brings the thing to life. If they can breathe life into this and say, okay, here's to the heart of the matter. This is what we know, and this is what our experts said. If you will remember, and you bring this person back around again to reinforce your statement here, I think that that's very, very important.
Well, let's see if the prosecution listens to us, Joseph. Joseph Scott Morgan, you heard the ER doc giving his evaluation. What do you think?
I think the biggest key here, Michael, is the fact that he makes reference to when she shows up, that one of her pupils is non-reactive, or as we refer to it as blown, and the other one is sluggish. That means that in the acute phase, when she rolled through the doors there, she was already in a state of physical compromise relative to what was going on within her head at that moment in time. This is not something that kind of crept in over a long period of time. This is an acute event that's happened. So that gives us an indication perhaps of what kind of timeline we're looking at. This is not something where you have a child that's moderately responsive, she can still talk and that sort of thing, and shows up at the hospital and suddenly she goes into arrest. This happens, she's in this condition when she rolls through the door. And the doctor at this point in time at Fort Hamilton, the ER doc, remember, he's the first person that's going to put eyes on her, decide what her plan of treatment is going to be. And he makes a decision that they don't have the ability to take care of her at this point. So therefore, they're going to send her to Children's in Cincinnati, which, by the way, is a fantastic facility. And if you have that at your disposal, man, you want her up there as quickly as you can to try to save her.
So taking what you've said, it suggests to me and maybe to the jury that it was acute, meaning it wasn't something that had happened over a period of time. There was an acute event that took place that led to these injuries. And now we just don't know what the cause was, because there was such a short period of time between when Jason Wesche dropped off his daughter, when she, quote, passed out, and when 911 was called and she was taken to the hospital. Could all of these injuries have happened so quickly? That's really what the jury's going to have to figure out.
Yeah. If I could just offer one more bit here, this is not necessarily. This just means that that in my opinion, the fatal insult took place at that moment in time, or that event that led to this tragedy. That does not dismiss other things that may have happened in the days preceding that could be in a healing phase, say more superficial indications of ongoing abuse if she's been in this woman's care for this period of time. So you have to contextualize all of these injuries, and that's what makes this an uphill battle, Michael, I think, for everyone involved.
And so you could have basically a thin-skulled or an eggshell plaintiff of sorts, where that final blow did the damage, but it was built up on other things over a period of time.
Yes.
And again,
Correct.
Crazy for the jury to have to try and wade through that. Joseph Scott Morgan, pretty clear that she just went downhill from the moment she got to this hospital and died 10 days later. But this doctor doesn't really help us figure out, what some of the causes might be. It sounds more like he's just trying to deal with what's put in front of him.
Yeah, and he's there to kind of pick up the pieces, isn't he? But I think that it is powerful. It can be impactful on the jury so that they understand that this child was unconscious. That has to be established. That he also stated that in his medical opinion, the child never had a chance of recovery, that there was nothing else that they can do. And that's a seminal moment in this whole narrative, Michael, moving forward, because then it becomes a very bleak picture. Now we're on death watch. And as a matter of fact, we've had to administer this level of medication just to make her, remember, he used the word comfortable, and also to prevent her brain from swelling any further. Now, he's also presenting in the narrative, well, we had to take her off of all that medication. What's going through the minds of that jury at that moment in time? And so they have to do this over a protracted period of time. And that can be interpreted in any number of ways. Maybe some of the jury that's not fully aware of the way medicines work on the bodies and that sort of thing, they see this as maybe pain and suffering at that point in time. So it opens up this unusual door, I think, or a very dynamic environment when you begin to, we deal with things like gun gunshot wounds and people die immediately. But when you have particularly a small child that's essentially languishing over a period of time, that's very, very powerful. And I think that kind of goes to the heart of the matter of what this little girl and her family had to endure through this period of time. And then, of course, it comes down, you boil it down to the fact that they had to do a brain death assessment. And he didn't go into all of the details with that. But, suffice it to say, that's what he's there for. He had to actually definitively say that this child has no chance of recovery, and we are essentially going to have to allow her to pass on at this point.
And the sympathy factor is just growing and growing as the jury hears about this whole horrible scene play out. And it makes it harder for them. Who doesn't want to find justice for this 3-year-old? Who doesn't want to find somebody responsible? Well, is it Lindsay Partin? Is it somebody we don't know enough about? That's a tough decision they're going to have to face. So let me ask you, Joseph Scott Morgan, you're a forensic guy. Are you predisposed to finding what you want to find because that's what you find?
I try to be as open-minded as I possibly can without my brains falling out of my skull. But I try to be open to these sorts of things. Shaken baby syndrome has become a toxic diagnoses over the past few years because, like Dr. Makaroff had stated, it is an indication of a mechanism. And it can, you can shake a child and you can certainly generate injuries, but there's a whole litany of things that come along with this idea of shaken baby syndrome, and if detached retinas and blindness and all these other things that come along with it. When you use kind of this broad term, which she's using, abusive head trauma, this can be used to encapsulate a whole lot of things. Strikes to the back of the head, strikes to the chin, slaps to the face. This child had a ecchymosis or a contused area adjacent to one of the supraorbital ridges around the eye. So there's a whole. You're cutting out everything, I think, is one of the problems when you say shaken baby syndrome. So you don't go in specifically looking for that. You have to look in to this kind of big spectrum of indicators that kind of give this overall diagnosis of abusive head trauma.
Yeah, and I understand that it is changing. And Joseph Scott Morgan, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate your insights. This is a great case to get your input. Appreciate it. Thank you, sir. We'll see you next time.